new stats show you a comparative look at heroin use back in the 1960s and heroin use today, and the demographic has completely shifted, and I want to give you a few examples of that. In the 1960s, people first used heroin in their teens, and now they're waiting until later in life to use heroin. They're usually in their 20s, their early 20s when they start off. The fact that heroin use in the United States has increased recently is definitely disheartening. It's sad, but I'm going to explain to you why that's happening. But back in the day, there was another shift. Non-white and white individuals, and the number of non-whites using heroin has decreased significantly. The number of white individuals using heroin has increased significantly. So you see that over there in that graph, and that's kind of fascinating. And again, the reason for it is very, very clear, but I'll get to that in a second. And back in the day, men were much more likely to use heroin, but they're now using heroin at lower rates. Women are using it at higher rates, but as you can see at this point, they're pretty much the same. Women are a little more likely to use heroin than men. So I'm going to explain all of this to you. The reason why heroin use has shot up so much in the United States is because people have been addicted to painkillers. Painkillers have been overprescribed. Opioids, as they're referred to, have been overprescribed. And so the government realized that these pharmaceutical companies have been pushing doctors to prescribe them. Doctors have been overprescribing them. And as a result, addiction has shot up. So they started passing these regulations to ensure doctors would not prescribe as many. And also, it's an expensive drug to take. So people who are addicted to painkillers, legal painkillers that they get through their doctor, realized, hey, you know what? Heroin pretty much accomplishes the same thing, and it's much cheaper. So that's why you're seeing an increase in heroin use in the United States. It's really tied to pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So I was trying to think. I have no recollection of being in high school or college where I saw anyone ever doing heroin. I remember the first time I had moved into New York City, and in Washington Square Park, that's where it's known, like all the heroin junkies, I suppose, hang out. And have you ever seen anyone on heroin, or you've maybe seen video?
No, I haven't.
They sort of look like they're in slow motion, just kind of hunched over. A lot of comedians in New York do jokes about them because you see them and it's very obvious that they're on heroin. But I am fascinated by this because even though I understand what you're saying about why this makes sense, heroin strikes me as such a, that was the no-no drug, like the absolute no-no drug. So the idea that it's going up with white people who presumably are educated, and you know what I mean, I'm taking some jumps here, but that's generally by the stories we do. And doing it later in life when you have more informed choices. I'm completely fascinated by this.
Well, I think the way that it works is, let's say you are in pain, you just had some sort of surgical procedure, and you do need painkillers, right? I mean, who's more likely to have health insurance and the resources necessary to get their hands on those prescription drugs? It's usually white people that are from a higher socioeconomic status, right? They're older, they have more money, so they're able to get their healthcare needs met. So they start off with the painkillers, and it's highly addictive, right? They get addicted to it, and then they need their fix. And that's why they start turning to the black market as soon as there are regulations set in place to ensure that it's more difficult for them to get the prescription version.
Yeah, did you know that there was also a law passed in New York City, I think a year and a half ago, where Bloomberg pushed that they weren't going to give painkillers out as easily, which I think is really interesting because I wonder if that had anything to do with the rising use of heroin in New York City. And I had a friend who just last week was in the hospital here at Cedars-Sinai, just close to here, and she had some stomach pains, and she said that they were pushing painkillers on her. She said she was in pain, but they wanted to keep giving her everything, and she was actually saying no. So that's also interesting how this is sort of a regional thing too, where you can get prescription stuff more easily in some places and less easily elsewhere. Yeah,
and by the way, if you want to look at the number of fatalities, we have one last graph for you, and it's really, really interesting. It looks at 2010, and they talk about drugs that are deadlier than marijuana. So if you can see the stat for marijuana all the way over to the right, 0 marijuana deaths, of course, that's obvious. When it comes to tobacco, 480,000, alcohol, 25,692. Look at prescription painkillers, so it's 16,651. It's actually lower than non-prescription drug overdoses.
Yeah, wait a minute. So is there prescription drug overdoses? There's prescription painkiller, but isn't that interesting? Or is that the one, when people overdose, they're really talking about painkillers, right? Most people that overdose on prescription drugs.
Yeah, so
that's actually pretty low, I think. I would have guessed much higher.
Really?
On that one, yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting to see that the legal drugs are more likely to kill people than the illegal drugs.
Yeah.
And look, tobacco is number one, right? And tobacco is not illegal.
Could it be because of the tobacco lobby?
Yeah.
Do you think it might have something to do with money?